The morning mist clung to Tokyo Bay like a funeral shroud as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stared at the intelligence reports scattered across his mahogany desk. The date was March 15, 1943, and the cherry blossoms outside Imperial Naval Headquarters bloomed in defiant beauty against a sky that would soon witness the systematic destruction of Japan's most elite fighting force. In his weathered hands, Nagumo held a document that would condemn thousands of his finest pilots to death, though neither he nor the architects of Japan's naval strategy yet understood the magnitude of their miscalculation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The report detailed American pilot training programs in places with names like Pensacola and Corpus Christi, facilities that Japanese intelligence had dismissed as insignificant compared to the rigorous, almost mystical preparation their own aviators endured. What they failed to grasp was that while Japan crafted individual warriors through years of grueling selection and training, America was building an industrial system that could mass-produce competent pilots at a pace that would soon overwhelm even the most skilled Japanese aces. The rising sun that had once symbolized Japanese naval dominance was about to set on an empire that had fatally underestimated its enemy's capacity for rapid adaptation and overwhelming production. The roots of Japan's catastrophic pilot losses stretched back to the euphoric days following Pearl Harbor, when Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's carrier strike force had achieved what many considered impossible. On that fateful December morning in 1941, Japanese naval aviation had demonstrated a level of precision and coordination that stunned the world. The pilots who launched from the decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku represented the pinnacle of military aviation training, men who had spent years mastering their craft under a system that prioritized perfection over quantity. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, the tactical genius behind the Pearl Harbor attack plan, had built his strategy around the assumption that Japan's qualitative superiority in pilot training would offset any numerical disadvantages. His aviators were not merely pilots, but aerial samurai, warriors who had undergone selection processes so rigorous that only 3% of applicants ever qualified for basic training. Those who survived the initial screening faced 3 years of intensive preparation that included not just flight instruction, but physical conditioning, spiritual discipline, and tactical education that American intelligence officers would later describe as bordering on the fanatical. The Japanese Naval Flying School at Kasumi-Gaura had become legendary throughout the Pacific for producing pilots whose skills seemed almost supernatural to their enemies. Students began their training before dawn with meditation and physical exercises designed to purify both body and spirit. They studied the technical specifications of every aircraft in both Japanese and American inventories until they could identify engine sounds from miles away. Most importantly, they learned to fly by instinct rather than instruments, developing an almost telepathic connection with their aircraft that allowed them to perform maneuvers that American pilots initially believed were impossible. Flight Petty Officer Hiroshi Nishizawa, who would later become Japan's most successful ace with 87 confirmed victories, exemplified this training philosophy. His instructors at Kasumi-Gaura had noted his ability to sense mechanical problems before instruments register them, to navigate by stars and wind patterns when radio equipment failed, and to engage multiple enemies simultaneously while maintaining perfect formation with his wingmen. Nishizawa's training had taken 4 years to complete, during which he accumulated more than 800 hours of flight time under conditions that ranged from tropical storms to Arctic temperatures. This intensive training system produced aviators of extraordinary individual capability, but it suffered from a fundamental flaw the Japanese planners refused to acknowledge until it was far too late. The same rigorous standards that created superior pilots also severely limited their numbers. In 1941, Japan's entire naval aviation training system
graduated fewer than 100 new carrier pilots annually, compared to the several thousand that American flight schools were already beginning to produce through abbreviated but standardized programs. The Japanese approach reflected deeply held cultural beliefs about the nature of warfare and the role of the individual warrior. In the samurai tradition that still influenced military thinking, victory came through spiritual purity, technical perfection, and willingness to sacrifice everything for emperor and homeland. American mass production methods, which Japanese officers had observed in civilian industries, seemed incompatible with the elevated nature of aerial combat. How could factories that produced automobiles also create the kind of warriors necessary to achieve air superiority over the Pacific? Admiral Nagumo himself embodied this traditional mindset. A veteran of the Russo-Japanese War who had risen through the ranks during an era when Japanese naval power was measured in battleships rather than aircraft carriers, he viewed aviation as a specialized tool rather than the decisive weapon it had already become. His strategic planning assumed that Japan's initial carrier strikes would cripple American naval capabilities long enough for traditional surface forces to establish permanent control over the Central Pacific. The possibility that air power might become a war of attrition, where numerical superiority could overcome individual excellence, seemed contrary to everything Japanese military doctrine taught about the decisive nature of superior training and fighting spirit. This philosophical blind spot became apparent in the months following Pearl Harbor, as Japanese carrier forces achieved victory after victory throughout the Pacific. The conquest of the Dutch East Indies, the devastation of Ceylon, the raids on Darwin and Colombo all seemed to validate the assumption that superbly trained pilots operating from mobile carrier platforms could maintain offensive momentum indefinitely. Intelligence reports from captured American installations painted a picture of an enemy aviation system in chaos, with hastily trained pilots flying obsolete aircraft against opponents whose skills had been honed through years of preparation. What Japanese intelligence failed to recognize was that American aviation training was undergoing a revolutionary transformation that would soon render traditional concepts of pilot preparation obsolete. While Japan continued to graduate pilots individually through artisanal methods, America was developing standardized training systems that could produce competent aviators in months rather than years. The Ford Motor Company's assembly line principles, which had revolutionized automobile manufacturing, were being applied to flight instruction with modifications that would prove devastatingly effective. The architect of this transformation was Admiral John Towers, Chief of Naval Operations for Air, who had recognized that modern aerial warfare demanded quantity as well as quality. Towers had studied reports of German aviation losses during the Battle of Britain and concluded that any prolonged air campaign would ultimately be decided by replacement rates rather than individual pilot skill. His solution was to create training programs that emphasized basic competency and standardized procedures over the kind of individual excellence that Japanese schools pursued. At training facilities in Corpus Christi, Pensacola, and Jacksonville, American flight instructors were developing curricula that could transform civilian college students into carrier-qualified pilots in 18 months.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sacrificed some of the specialized skills that made Japanese aviators so formidable in individual combat, but they produced pilots who could operate effectively as part of large formations using standardized tactics and equipment. More importantly, they could be expanded rapidly as war production demands increased. The contrast became apparent in the selection criteria used by each nation's aviation programs. Japanese flight schools required candidates to demonstrate exceptional physical conditioning, perfect vision, mathematical aptitude, and spiritual discipline before beginning flight training. American programs accepted applicants with correctable vision, average physical fitness, and basic educational backgrounds, relying on intensive but abbreviated instruction to bring them up to operational standards. Where Japan sought perfection in individuals, America aimed for adequacy in masses. This difference reflected broader disparities in industrial capacity and strategic thinking that Japanese planners had consistently underestimated. The same American economy that produced 17 million automobiles between 1941 and 1945 could also manufacture training aircraft, flight simulators, and aviation fuel at scales the Japanese industry could never match. American flight schools operating multiple shifts could graduate more pilots in a single month than Japan's entire system produced annually. Perhaps more significantly, American training emphasized survival and adaptability over the kind of spiritual commitment that Japanese doctrine considered essential for victory. American pilots learned to disengage from unfavorable combat situations, to rely on superior numbers and equipment rather than individual heroics, and to view themselves as valuable assets to be preserved rather than expendable warriors to be sacrificed for temporary tactical advantage. These principles, which Japanese officers dismissed as evidence of American weakness and lack of fighting spirit, would prove crucial as the Pacific War evolved into the kind of prolonged attrition campaign that Japanese strategy had never anticipated. The first hints of this coming transformation appeared during the Doolittle raid of April 1942, when 16 American B-25 bombers, launched from the carrier Hornet, struck targets across the Japanese mainland. The raid itself caused minimal physical damage, but its psychological impact on Japanese strategic thinking was profound. The fact that American carriers could approach within 400 miles of the Japanese coast without detection suggested that their opponents possessed capabilities that Japanese intelligence had not anticipated. More troubling for Japanese planners was the quality of American pilot performance during the raid. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle and his aircrews demonstrated navigation skills, formation discipline, and tactical flexibility that contradicted assumptions about American aviation training. These were not the poorly prepared pilots that Japanese propaganda had described, but competent professionals operating sophisticated equipment with precision and confidence. The Japanese response to the Doolittle raid revealed the strategic thinking that would ultimately prove so costly. Rather than reassessing their assumptions about American capabilities, Japanese leaders decided to accelerate their offensive operations in an attempt to destroy American naval forces before they could fully mobilize. Admiral Yamamoto, recognizing that Japan's window of opportunity was narrowing, proposed an ambitious operation to capture Midway Island and force the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive engagement that would establish Japanese control over the Central Pacific. The planning for the Midway operation exemplified the overconfidence that had characterized Japanese strategy since Pearl Harbor. Intelligence estimates suggested that American carrier forces had been so weakened by previous engagements that they could not mount effective resistance to a properly executed attack.
Southeast Asia approached the mission with the assumption that their superior training and experience would overcome any numerical disadvantages they might face. What they encountered instead was an American force that had learned valuable lessons from earlier defeats and was beginning to demonstrate the industrial advantages that would soon dominate Pacific naval warfare. The pilots flying from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown included veterans of the Coral Sea engagement who had gained crucial experience fighting Japanese carrier aircraft. But they also included recently graduated aviators whose training reflected the new emphasis on standardized procedures and coordinated attacks. The Battle of Midway, fought between June 4th and 7th, 1942, marked the beginning of Japan's irreversible decline in naval aviation capability. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and many of their most experienced pilots represented not just a tactical defeat, but the destruction of irreplaceable assets that Japan's training system could not replace. Pilots like Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack on Kaneohe Naval Air Station, and Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Kosaka, whose Zero had shot down more than 20 American aircraft, died in the waters around Midway, along with hundreds of their equally skilled comrades. The immediate impact of these losses was devastating, but the long-term consequences would prove even more significant. Japan's naval aviation training system, designed to produce small numbers of highly skilled pilots, could not rapidly replace the expertise that had been destroyed at Midway.
The survivors of the battle, many of whom were wounded or psychologically traumatized, found themselves expected to train replacement pilots while simultaneously conducting combat operations against an increasingly capable enemy. American forces, by contrast, were just beginning to demonstrate the advantages of their mass production approach to pilot training. The carriers that participated in subsequent operations carried air groups that mixed experienced veterans with recently graduated pilots who had trained on the latest equipment using standardized procedures developed through careful analysis of combat reports. While these newer pilots lacked the individual skills of their Japanese opponents, they operated as part of coordinated formations that maximized their collective effectiveness. The philosophical differences between Japanese and American aviation training became most apparent in their respective approaches to pilot conservation. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive engagement and willingness to sacrifice individual aircraft and pilots for tactical advantage. American procedures stressed survival techniques, defensive formations, and the importance of returning experienced pilots to base for future operations. These contrasting philosophies would have profound implications as the war evolved into the prolonged campaign that neither side had originally anticipated.
Measure of professional competence never experienced. Japanese pilot training also suffered from strategic decisions that prioritized short-term operational needs over long-term sustainability. As American forces began their island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific, Japanese commanders found themselves forced to commit their remaining experienced pilots to defensive operations that offered little hope of victory but seemed necessary to slow the American advance. Each engagement resulted in irreplaceable losses that further degraded Japan's overall aviation capability. The training facilities themselves reflected the growing disparity between the two nations' aviation programs. American flight schools in Texas, Florida, and California operated around the clock using standardized curricula that could be replicated at multiple locations. Japanese training remained concentrated at traditional bases like Kasamigaura, where instructor-to-student ratios allowed for individualized attention, but severely limited overall throughput. As fuel shortages began affecting civilian transportation, Japanese training flights were reduced in frequency and duration, further compromising the preparation of replacement pilots. By late 1943, the cumulative effects of Japan's flawed aviation strategy were becoming apparent to perceptive observers within the Imperial Navy. Intelligence reports from the Solomon Islands campaign described American pilots whose individual skills might be inferior to Japanese standards, but who operated with tactical flexibility and numerical superiority that made them increasingly effective. More troubling were accounts of American pilots who had survived multiple combat engagements, gained experience, and returned to operations with improved capabilities. The contrast with Japanese pilot utilization could not have been more stark. Where American doctrine emphasized the value of experienced pilots as trainers and tactical innovators, Japanese culture demanded that elite aviators remain in combat until death or incapacitation removed them from service. This approach, which seemed to honor traditional samurai values, actually accelerated the degradation of Japan's naval aviation capability by preventing the accumulation of institutional knowledge that might have improved training programs and tactical procedures. The strategic implications extended beyond individual pilot performance to encompass entire carrier air groups and their operational effectiveness. American carriers entering service in 1943 carried air groups whose pilots had trained together using standardized procedures, creating unit cohesion that enhanced their collective performance. Japanese carriers, forced to replace combat losses with individually trained pilots who had never worked together,
struggled to maintain the kind of coordinated attacks that had made their early operations so successful. Admiral Nagumo, reviewing casualty reports from the Guadalcanal campaign, began to recognize the magnitude of the crisis facing Japanese naval aviation. The pilots he had led to victory at Pearl Harbor were either dead, wounded, or so exhausted by continuous combat operations that their effectiveness had declined dramatically. Their replacements, despite completing the same rigorous training program, lacked the combat experience necessary to match American pilots who were gaining proficiency through sustained operations against increasingly desperate Japanese forces. The realization came too late to influence Japanese strategy, which remained committed to offensive operations that required the kind of pilot expertise that no longer existed in sufficient numbers. The secret order that would ultimately condemn 67% of Japanese carrier pilots to death had not yet been issued, but the conditions that would make such losses inevitable were already in place. Japan's aviation training system, designed for a short war against a presumably inferior opponent, was about to confront the reality of prolonged conflict against an enemy whose industrial capacity and strategic adaptability
been catastrophically underestimated. As 1943 drew to a close, the stage was set for the final phase of Japan's naval aviation tragedy. The pilots who had achieved such remarkable success in the war's early months were largely gone, replaced by increasingly inexperienced aviators whose training, while still rigorous by traditional standards, could not compensate for the systematic advantages that American mass production methods were creating. The cherry blossoms that had bloomed so beautifully outside Imperial Naval Headquarters would soon become symbols of the ephemeral nature of Japanese aviation supremacy, beautiful but brief, destined to fall before the relentless advance of an enemy whose strength had been built not on individual excellence, but on industrial might and strategic wisdom that Japanese leaders had failed to comprehend until it was far too late to matter. The first official acknowledgement of Japan's aviation crisis arrived at Admiral Isoroku Toyoda's headquarters on February 8, 1944, buried within routine operational reports from the Marshall Islands. Flight Commander Jiro Tanaka, one of the few surviving aces from the original Pearl Harbor strike force, had submitted a detailed analysis of recent combat operations that painted a devastating picture of Japanese pilot performance against increasingly aggressive American carrier raids. His aircraft, a battle-scarred Zero that had somehow survived 37 combat missions, bore testament to the individual skill that Japanese training had always emphasized. Yet Tanaka's report focused not on his own achievements, but on the alarming rate at which replacement pilots were being lost during their first encounters with American forces. The statistics were undeniable and terrifying. Of the 43 newly graduated pilots assigned to Tanaka's squadron between November 1943 and January 1944, 31 had been killed or reported missing within their first 3 combat sorties. These were not the hastily trained conscripts the Japanese propaganda described as filling American carrier air groups, but graduates of the same rigorous Kasumigara program that had produced Japan's most celebrated aces. They possessed technical skills that exceeded anything American flight schools attempted to teach, yet they were dying at rates that threatened to eliminate Japan's remaining naval aviation capability within months rather than years. The fundamental problem, though none of Japan's senior commanders yet understood its full implications, lay in the transformation of Pacific air warfare from individual duels between skilled pilots to systematic campaigns waged by massed formations using coordinated tactics. American carrier air groups had evolved into integrated strike forces, where individual pilot limitations were compensated by superior numbers, standardized procedures, and, most crucially, doctrine that emphasized mutual support over personal heroics. Japanese pilots, trained to seek individual combat and demonstrate personal courage through aggressive engagement, found themselves repeatedly outnumbered and outmaneuvered by opponents whose collective effectiveness far exceeded their individual capabilities. Lieutenant Tetsuzo Iwamoto,
whose 58 confirmed victories made him one of Japan's most successful surviving aces, described the changing nature of aerial combat in a letter to his former instructor at the Yokonen Flight School. Where once Japanese pilots could expect to engage American aircraft in roughly equal numbers, they now faced formations of 20 or 30 enemy fighters, supported by radar-directed combat air patrols that seemed to anticipate Japanese tactics before they could be executed. More troubling was the quality of American pilot performance, which showed steady improvement rather than the decline that Japanese intelligence had predicted. The American pilots engaging Japanese forces in early 1944 represented the mature product of industrial training methods
that had been refined through careful analysis of combat experience. Flight schools in Pensacola and Corpus Christi were now graduating aviators whose basic competency equaled or exceeded that of Japanese pilots with twice their flight time, achieved through standardized curricula that emphasized practical skills over traditional concepts of warrior spirit. These pilots might lack the intuitive connection with their aircraft that characterized Japan's finest aviators, but they operated with tactical discipline and formation coherence that made them extraordinarily effective when deployed in large numbers. The contrast became most apparent during the massive carrier battles that erupted around the Mariana Islands in June 1944. Operation Forager, the American amphibious assault on Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, drew the remnants of Japan's combined fleet into what Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa hoped would be a decisive engagement that might restore Japanese naval supremacy in the Central Pacific. Ozawa commanded 9 aircraft carriers, embarking more than 400 aircraft, but his air groups represented a patchwork of experienced survivors and recently trained replacements whose combined effectiveness fell far short of their nominal strength. The Japanese approach to the Mariana operation reflected strategic thinking that had not evolved since the early months of the war. Ozawa planned to use land-based aircraft from Guam and Saipan to supplement his carrier forces, creating numerical superiority that would overcome American advantages in pilot training and equipment quality. His aviators would demonstrate the spiritual superiority that Japanese doctrine considered decisive in aerial combat, achieving victory through aggressive attack and willingness to sacrifice individual aircraft for strategic objectives. What they encountered instead was an American naval force that had been transformed by 2 years of combat experience and industrial expansion into the most formidable carrier fleet in naval history. Task Force 58, commanded by Admiral Mark Meicher, deployed 15 aircraft carriers, embarking more than 900 aircraft, flown by pilots whose training represented the perfection of mass production techniques applied to military aviation. These air groups included veterans of previous campaigns whose experience had been systematically incorporated into training programs, creating institutional knowledge that enhanced the performance of newer pilots. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought between June 19 and 20, 1944, demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of Japan's failure to adapt its aviation strategy to the realities of industrial warfare. Japanese strike aircraft launching from Ozawa's carriers flew into defensive formations that seemed almost impenetrable. American fighters, directed by radar operators who could track incoming attacks from hundreds of miles away, intercepted Japanese formations with numerical superiority and tactical coordination that overwhelmed even the most skilled individual pilots. Warrant Officer Kensuke Muto, flying from the carrier Zuikaku in one of the morning strikes against the American fleet, found himself engaging 12 American Hellcat fighters with only 3 wingmen for support. His Zero possessed superior maneuverability, and he had accumulated more flight time than any of his opponents. Yet the Americans attacked in coordinated pairs that denied him opportunities for individual combat. When Muto attempted the kind of aggressive engagement that had brought him 14 previous victories, American pilots simply disengaged and allowed fresh fighters to continue the attack. The Americans were not fighting for personal glory, but to destroy Japanese aircraft through systematic attrition, a concept that Japanese doctrine had never adequately addressed. The results were devastating beyond anything Japanese naval aviation had previously experienced. Of the 373 aircraft that Ozawa launched against the American fleet during the two-day battle, 315 were destroyed with minimal damage inflicted
on their targets. American pilots, demonstrating the tactical flexibility that industrial training methods had emphasized, avoided the kind of individual duels where Japanese skill advantages might prove decisive. Instead, they attacked in overwhelming numbers, used superior aircraft performance to dictate engagement terms, and withdrew when faced with unfavorable odds. Even more significant than the immediate losses was the destruction of Japan's remaining pool of experienced pilots. Squadron leaders who had survived Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raids, and Midway died over the Philippine Sea along with the institutional knowledge they represented. Petty Officer Toshio Ota, whose 34 victories had made him a legend among Japanese naval aviators, was shot down while attempting to lead a coordinated attack on the American carrier Lexington. His death, along with those of dozens of other veteran pilots, eliminated irreplaceable expertise that Japan's training system could never restore. American casualties during the same engagement totaled 29 aircraft lost, with most pilots recovered by efficient search and rescue operations that reflected the same systematic approach to warfare that characterized all aspects of their naval aviation program. Where Japanese doctrine accepted pilot losses as inevitable costs of aggressive operations, American procedures emphasized pilot preservation through superior equipment, coordinated tactics, and comprehensive rescue capabilities that returned experienced aviators to service rather than treating them as expendable resources. The immediate aftermath of the Philippine Sea disaster forced Japanese naval commanders to confront the reality that their aviation training philosophy had become a strategic liability. Admiral Ozawa, surveying the wreckage of his once formidable carrier force, recognized that Japan no longer possessed the pilot quality or aircraft numbers necessary to challenge American naval dominance through conventional operations. The carriers that limped back to Japanese bases carried air groups so depleted that they could barely conduct defensive patrols, much less offensive strikes against enemy forces. The institutional response to this crisis revealed the depth of Japan's strategic confusion. Rather than acknowledging the fundamental flaws in their aviation training system, Japanese commanders sought salvation through technological solutions and tactical innovations that would restore their competitive edge without requiring changes to established doctrine. The development of new aircraft designs, improvement of existing fighters, and refinement of attack procedures all received priority over the systematic reforms that might have addressed the underlying problems. Meanwhile, American carrier aviation continued its relentless improvement through methods that Japanese observers still could not fully comprehend. New pilots arriving at operational squadrons had trained on aircraft identical to those they would fly in combat, using standardized procedures that could be implemented immediately without extensive additional preparation. Flight simulators, a technology that Japanese training facilities had never adopted, allowed American aviators to practice complex scenarios repeatedly without consuming precious fuel or risking aircraft and training accidents. The contrast in training philosophy became most apparent in the preparation of replacement pilots for carrier operations. American flight schools had developed systematic programs that could qualify civilian college students for carrier duty in 18 months, including extensive practice on actual carriers using standardized approach procedures that minimized accidents during the critical transition to operational flying. Japanese training, despite its longer duration and more intensive selection process, produced pilots who often required additional months of carrier practice before they could safely operate from flight decks under combat conditions. Admiral Takajiro Onishi, one of the few Japanese commanders who recognized the magnitude of their
aviation crisis, proposed radical changes to pilot training and tactical doctrine that might have addressed some of these deficiencies. His recommendations included abbreviated training programs modeled on American methods, emphasis on survival techniques rather than aggressive engagement, and development of coordinated tactics that would maximize the effectiveness of limited pilot resources. These proposals were rejected by traditional naval leadership as contrary to the warrior spirit that had always defined Japanese military excellence. The rejection of Onishi's reforms reflected cultural attitudes that extended far beyond military aviation into the fundamental nature of Japanese society during the Pacific War. The concept that spiritual preparation and individual excellence could overcome material disadvantages had become so central to Japanese strategic thinking that leaders could not acknowledge evidence contradicting these beliefs without questioning the ideological foundations of their entire war effort. To admit that American industrial methods might be superior to traditional Japanese approaches would have required a psychological transformation that proved impossible for men raised in the samurai tradition. This ideological rigidity became even more problematic as American forces launched their final offensive operations against Japanese positions in the Central and Western Pacific. The island-hopping campaign that began with the Marshall Islands and continued through the Marianas to the Philippines created exactly the kind of prolonged attrition warfare that Japan's aviation training system could not sustain. Each engagement resulted in irreplaceable pilot losses that further degraded Japanese capabilities, while American strength continued to increase through systematic replacement and improvement programs. The human cost of this strategic failure became apparent in the personal accounts of Japanese pilots who survived the carnage. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, whose exceptional skill had allowed him to survive numerous engagements despite severe injuries, described the psychological impact of watching newly trained pilots die in their first combat missions. These young men possessed the same technical skills and fighting spirit that had characterized earlier generations of Japanese aviators, but they lacked the combat experience necessary to survive against American pilots whose training emphasized practical survival techniques over abstract concepts of warrior honor. The final phase of Japan's aviation tragedy began with the American invasion of the Philippines in October 1944. An operation that drew the remaining elements of the combined fleet into a desperate attempt to prevent the loss of Japan's most important overseas territory. The resulting Battle of Leyte Gulf represented the largest naval engagement in history, involving more than 300 ships and 1,500 aircraft in a 4-day campaign that would effectively end Japanese naval aviation as an organized fighting force. Admiral Ozawa, commanding the last operational Japanese carrier force, approached this engagement with full knowledge that his ships carried insufficient aircraft and pilots to challenge American superiority through conventional tactics. His 4 carriers embarked fewer than 100 aircraft, many flown by pilots with minimal training who had been rushed to operational status as American forces approached the Philippines. These aviators represented the final product of Japan's accelerated training programs, young men whose preparation had been compressed into months rather than the years traditionally considered necessary for carrier qualification. The disparity in pilot quality became tragically apparent during the initial phases of the battle, when Japanese aircraft attempting to attack American invasion forces found themselves engaging fighter formations that seemed to anticipate their every move. American pilots, directed by sophisticated radar systems and supported by
Coordinated air defense networks intercepted Japanese strikes with overwhelming numerical superiority and tactical advantages that made individual pilot skill largely irrelevant. The few Japanese aircraft that penetrated American defenses achieved minimal results, while suffering casualties that eliminated the last remnants of experienced Japanese naval aviation. Ensign Yoshio Fukui, flying his first combat mission from the carrier Zuikaku, described his final radio transmission as American fighters closed in on his formation over Leyte Gulf. His voice, preserved in American intelligence recordings, captured the bewilderment of pilots who had been trained for individual combat but found themselves facing systematic destruction by opponents whose collective effectiveness overwhelmed personal courage and technical skill. Fukui's death, along with those of most of his squadron mates, represented not just individual tragedy, but the collapse of an entire philosophy of military aviation that had once seemed invincible. The aftermath of Leyte Gulf left Japan with virtually no operational carrier aviation capability. The 4 carriers that had participated in the battle were either sunk or so damaged that they could not continue operations, while their aircraft and pilots had been almost entirely destroyed in futile attacks against superior American forces. More significantly, the loss of these final aviation assets meant that Japan could no longer conduct offensive operations against American naval forces, effectively ceding control of the Pacific to an enemy whose industrial capacity continued to produce new carriers, aircraft, and pilots at unprecedented rates. The statistical record of this disaster provided stark evidence of the consequences flowing from Japan's flawed aviation strategy. Between June 1944 and January 1945, Japanese naval aviation losses exceeded 4,500 aircraft and nearly 3,000 pilots, representing the virtual elimination of capabilities that had taken decades to develop. During the same period, American carrier aviation expanded to include more than 100 aircraft carriers, embarking thousands of aircraft flown by pilots whose training represented continuous refinement of industrial methods that could replace losses and expand capabilities simultaneously. The contrast in replacement rates told the complete story of strategic failure that Japanese leaders had refused to acknowledge until it was too late to matter. American flight training programs were graduating more than 2,000 new pilots monthly by late 1944, while Japanese schools struggled to produce fewer than 100 replacements for losses that were accelerating beyond their ability to calculate accurately. More importantly, American pilots were arriving at operational squadrons with training that prepared them for immediate effectiveness, while Japanese replacements required additional preparation that consumed time and resources that no longer existed. Admiral Toyota, surveying intelligence reports that documented the scope of Japan's aviation losses, finally authorized the desperate measures that would consume the last remnants of Japanese naval aviation. The kamikaze tactics that began during the Philippines campaign represented not a strategic innovation, but an acknowledgement that conventional pilot training and tactical doctrine could no longer produce results against American forces whose numerical and qualitative superiority had become insurmountable through traditional methods. The transformation of Japanese pilots into suicide attackers reflected the ultimate failure of an aviation training philosophy that had emphasized individual excellence over systematic effectiveness. Young men who had spent months learning complex flight procedures and tactical formations found themselves assigned to missions where their only training requirement was the ability to dive their aircraft into enemy ships. The technical skills that had once distinguished Japanese aviators became irrelevant when the infrastructure necessary to support their skills had been destroyed.
Their role was reduced to guided missiles rather than air superiority fighters or precision bombers. Ensign Yukio Seki, who led the first organized kamikaze attack on October 25, 1944, exemplified the tragedy of Japan's aviation crisis. His training at Kasumigara had prepared him for the kind of individual aerial combat that was no longer possible against American forces, yet military necessity demanded that he sacrifice his life in a single attack that would eliminate years of expensive preparation along with any possibility of future contribution to Japan's war effort. Seki's death, along with those of hundreds of other kamikaze pilots, represented the systematic waste of human resources that industrial warfare demanded but that Japan's training philosophy had never anticipated. The final statistics of Japanese naval aviation losses during the Pacific War provided devastating evidence of strategic miscalculation that had condemned an entire generation of young men to death. Of the approximately 15,000 pilots trained by Japanese naval aviation programs between 1941 and 1945, more than 10,000 were killed in action,
representing a casualty rate of 67% that exceeded losses suffered by any other military organization during the war. These deaths occurred not because Japanese pilots lacked courage or skill, but because their training and doctrine had prepared them for a type of warfare that no longer existed once American industrial capacity had been fully mobilized. The American approach to pilot training and utilization, which Japanese commanders had initially dismissed as evidence of weakness and lack of fighting spirit, had proven devastatingly effective in the kind of prolonged campaign that Pacific warfare had become. By treating pilots as valuable assets to be preserved and improved rather than warriors to be expended for tactical advantage, American doctrine had created sustainable aviation capabilities that could maintain offensive operations indefinitely while Japanese strength declined through irreplaceable attrition. The cherry blossoms that had bloomed so beautifully outside Imperial Naval Headquarters during the spring of 1944 had long since fallen when Admiral Toyota received the final reports documenting Japan's aviation losses. The young men who should have returned to see those blossoms bloom again lay scattered across the Pacific from the Marshalls to the Philippines, their aircraft and their dreams destroyed by strategic decisions that had fatally underestimated the nature of modern warfare and the industrial capacity of their enemies. The lesson written in their sacrifice would resonate long after the war ended, a testament to the dangers of military doctrine that emphasized individual excellence over systematic effectiveness, spiritual preparation over practical training, and traditional values over adaptive innovation. Japan's naval aviation had achieved remarkable early success through methods that seemed to validate centuries of samurai tradition, but ultimate defeat had come through failure to recognize that industrial warfare demanded industrial solutions rather than artisanal approaches to military preparation. In the end, the 67% of Japanese carrier pilots who never returned home had died not because they lacked the courage or skill to fight effectively, but because their leaders had committed them to a war for which their training and doctrine had left them fundamentally unprepared. Their tragedy lay not in personal failure, but in strategic blindness that had prevented Japan from adapting to the realities of 20th century warfare until adaptation was no longer possible and sacrifice had become the only remaining option. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.